I can't tell you how excited I am for this announcement. I'm now joined by Congressman Jamie Raskin for a new series that we're calling Class with Jamie Raskin. So every episode, he'll take on a different right-wing constitutional fallacy, one of these bogus claims that have gained a foothold in our body politic by virtue of sheer repetition by conservatives. And we're going to cover the Second Amendment and presidential immunity and Christian nationalism and so much more. And trust me, no one is better at swatting down perversions of the Constitution like Jamie Raskin. So I'm going to hand it over to the congressman where he'll tackle today's right-wing fallacy, this idea that it is unfair and undemocratic and therefore unconstitutional to bar insurrectionists who are former federal office holders from the ballot, an issue that's especially relevant today. Congressman.
Brian, thank you so much. I'm really delighted to do this, and thank you for prompting me to do it. Everywhere that I go in the country, I'm out campaigning for the Democrats, campaigning for the democracy. People say, God, I really wish I could do a constitutional law class with you. And then you actually said, well, why don't we do a constitutional law class? And so we're going to take the primary fallacies and fever dreams of America's right wing with respect to the Constitution, and we're going to explore them, analyze them, and then debunk them and refute them. And it is through that process that we're going to learn about what the real Constitution says. So today, we're going to start off with this fallacy that it is unfair and undemocratic and therefore unconstitutional to bar insurrectionists who are former federal office holders from the ballot. I'm going to start just by showing you the text of the Constitution, Section 3 of the 14th Amendment. It says, no person shall be a senator or representative in Congress or elector of president and vice president or hold any office, civil or military, under the United States or under any state, who, having previously taken oath as a member of Congress or as an officer of the United States or as a member of any state legislature or as an executive or judicial officer of any state, to support the Constitution of the United States, shall have engaged in insurrection or rebellion against the same, or given aid or comfort to the enemies thereof. But Congress may, by a vote of 2/3 of each house, remove such disability. Okay, this is the so-called insurrection disqualification clause. If you've sworn an oath to support the Constitution of the United States, you've violated that oath by engaging in insurrection or rebellion against the Union, then you're never allowed to hold public office again at the federal level or the state level. And we would say that the plain meaning of Section 3 of the 14th Amendment is perfectly clear. But I want to look at the main thing that you hear people say in public debates and political debates when you turn on the TV, which is, it would just be unfair and undemocratic and therefore unconstitutional to exclude Donald Trump from the presidential ballot in Colorado and from the rest of the country because it would uniquely punish him and it would deny the people the right to choose the candidate of their choice, and therefore it should be deemed to be unconstitutional. So let's start with the fallacy, which I think is at the very foundation of this claim, and that fallacy is that if something is deemed to be undemocratic or unfair, it's unconstitutional. And I think we can determine very quickly that this is false. In fact, there are lots of things that are unfair and undemocratic that are not only perfectly consistent with the Constitution, but are required by the Constitution, are compelled by the Constitution. In fact, I think you could say that the history of our country has been defined by social and political struggles of the people to take things that were in the Constitution that were unfair and undemocratic and to take them out and to replace them with a more democratic Constitution and therefore a more perfect union.
Folks, if we're going to win re-election, I need you by my side from the
majority of the 17 constitutional amendments we've had since the original Bill of Rights are all democratizing amendments. They are amendments that have swept in people who were excluded and disenfranchised and discriminated against and subjugated under prior constitutional arrangements. So the 13th Amendment abolished slavery. What's more unfair or undemocratic than that? And yet that was cemented into the pre-Civil War, pre-Reconstruction Constitution by the Supreme Court in the Dred Scott decision, which said that African Americans had no rights the white man was bound to respect, and that the Constitution was a white man's compact. And it was built based on the idea of white-only political institutions. And so it took us a civil war and the passage of the 13th Amendment to overturn that undemocratic and unfair idea that was built into the fabric of the Constitution. The 19th Amendment banned sex discrimination in voting and doubled the franchise in America. The 24th Amendment banned poll taxes in federal elections, later extended to state elections by ruling of the Supreme Court. So, all of which is to say, the whole trajectory of our constitutional development has been to take undemocratic features built into the Constitution and to abolish them and replace them with a more democratic Constitution. So just to say something is undemocratic does not mean by a long shot that it's unconstitutional. And in fact, I'm sure all of you are thinking of 5 or 6 different features of the Constitution today that are totally undemocratic, and yet the court has defined them as very much part of the constitutional structure. For my friends in Washington, D.C., 713,000 draftable tax-paying citizens of the United States are the only residents of a national capital on the planet Earth who are not represented in their own federal legislature. They've noticed for a couple centuries and more that their situation is undemocratic and unfair, and they brought a lawsuit asserting that it was undemocratic and unfair and therefore unconstitutional in a 1998 case called Alexander versus Daley, which was rejected on appeal by a court in a decision actually written by Merrick Garland. And Garland said, yeah, it's unfair, it's undemocratic, something should be done about it, but there's nothing that we can do because it's built into the state-based structure of the political constitution. In order to be represented in the Senate and in the House of Representatives with voting representatives, you need to be a state. And so that gave the impetus to our friends in Washington to fight harder for their movement to be admitted as a state by Congress under Article 4 of the Constitution, which gives Congress the power to admit new states. But see, there's an example where an undemocratic and unjust political feature of the Constitution was deemed to be perfectly constitutional. All right, so I hope I've proven to you that the underlying fallacy of the argument disassembles its entire grammar, but let's pursue it even further. They would say it's undemocratic and therefore unconstitutional to ban insurrectionists like Donald Trump from the ballot. Okay, and I will take on the claim that it's undemocratic. All right? Now, I want to start this way. I've heard several commentators opine that it's profoundly unfair to treat Donald Trump as a unique case for disqualification for service as president of the United States just because he sat there for 3.5 hours watching his mob violently attack our police officers and break their fingers and arms and legs and jaws and necks and so on, putting dozens and dozens of them in the hospital while he sat in the dining room adjacent to the Oval Office watching it on TV. And so it said, well, why should he be treated differently from anybody else? It's not fair to him, and it's not democratic in terms of denying the people to choose who they want for president. Well, I would start with this. More than 100 million Americans are disqualified for running for president of the United States. You've got to be a natural-born citizen to run for the United States. So not just a citizen, but a natural-born citizen. There are 35 million people, by my count, who are disqualified for that reason alone. They might be fantastic presidents, but they can't serve. And there's a much larger group that's disqualified. There are more than 75 million people who can't run because they're not old enough to run. You've got to be 35 years old in order to be president of the United States. That, too, is in the Constitution. In any event, you get the point. There is a massive disqualification of people who can't run for president based on age, based on their place of being born. By the way, somebody who understands that principle perfectly is named Donald Trump, because he ran around the country on his birther conspiracy theory campaign saying that Barack Obama could not hold the office of president because he was born abroad in Kenya. Now, that was a lie. He was wrong as a matter of fact. Barack Obama was not born in Kenya. He was born in the United States. But Trump was right on the principle. If he had been born out of the country, he would not have been qualified. And Donald Trump is not qualified for the same reason. He is an insurrectionist, and the Colorado Supreme Court determined he was an insurrectionist with 5 days of fact-finding at trial with witnesses and testimony mobilized on both sides, and heard the case and determined that he had indeed participated in insurrection. That just echoed, of course, the grounds for Donald Trump's impeachment. He was impeached by the House of Representatives for having incited insurrection against the Constitution and against the Union. And when it went over to the Senate, there was a 57-43 vote agreeing with the House of Representatives that he'd incited an insurrection. Now, Trump did beat the constitutional spread, as we say, because there were only 57 of 100 votes against him. We needed 67 in order to convict. But nonetheless, we've got robust bicameral, bipartisan majorities defining as a constitutional fact that he actually engaged in the conduct, which was the insurrectionary incitement against the Constitution. There's another category of people, by the way, who can't hold the office of presidency. Another small group, like the group of insurrectionists, and that is people who've held the office before. The 22nd Amendment said that no person shall be elected to the office of the president more than twice. Barack Obama can't run for president again because he's served 2 terms. Is it undemocratic? Maybe not, if you include in the definition of democracy that we should be taking turns. In any event, even if you really want Barack Obama to be president again, you might say it's undemocratic. You might say it's unfair. You can't say it's unconstitutional. It's very clearly in the Constitution and the explicit purpose of the 22nd Amendment, just like the explicit purpose of Section 3 of the 14th Amendment, adopted in 1868 at the behest of the radical Republicans in Congress, was to disqualify those who'd engaged in insurrection from ever holding public office again. Now let me grab the bull by the horns, and let's talk about whether that's democratic or undemocratic to say that. And I'll start with something that Abraham Lincoln said at the beginning of the Civil War in 1861, where he said that insurrection is a war on the first principle of Republican government. The first principle of Republican government, which is the right of the people to choose their own leaders. Now let's think about what happened on January 6, 2021. There'd been a vigorous, aggressive presidential campaign across the country. Joe Biden beat Donald Trump by more than 7 million votes, 306 to 232 in the Electoral College, a margin which Donald Trump had actually described as an absolute landslide when he had beaten Hillary Clinton, bizarrely, by the exact same margin. So Joe Biden wins by an absolute landslide and more than 7 million in the popular vote. And Donald Trump, who had been conditioning his people to get ready for this fraudulent attack on the election for months, claimed, no, it's all fraud, it's all corruption. He brought 60 different cases, federal and state cases, all over the land. And in 60 different federal and state court judgments, 8 of them at least rendered by people that Donald Trump had himself nominated to the federal bench when he was president, the courts uniformly declared that there was no electoral corruption, there was no electoral mischief. There was no electoral fraud, and they rejected each and every one of those claims. And yet, as everybody knows, Donald Trump went ahead to go to the state legislatures to try to get them to reverse the popular votes of the people and just appoint electors in GOP-controlled states for Trump. He went to election officials like Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger in Georgia and said to them, just find me 11,780 votes. That's all I want. He was asking for fraud. That wasn't Donald Trump trying to stop electoral fraud. That was Donald Trump trying to commit electoral fraud. Just like he tried to accomplish a coup against his own appointed leaders in the Department of Justice who refused to fabricate charges of electoral fraud, and then he wanted to pluck from the bowels of the DOJ bureaucracy one guy, Jeffrey Clark, who was willing to do whatever Trump asked him to do. And remember his demand for the DOJ officials, just call the election corrupt and leave the rest to me and my friends in the House, by which he meant, of course, Jim Jordan and the gang. But when it came to January 6th, everything came down to Mike Pence. Let's get the Vice President of the United States to step outside of his proper constitutional role, which was ministerial and bureaucratic in nature, just to preside over the joint session of Congress, receiving the Electoral College votes that had been sent in by the governors in the so-called certificates of ascertainment, and unilaterally declare that Donald Trump was the winner. Simply pronounce that he would be president, or similarly, to kick the whole thing into the House of Representatives for a so-called contingent election under the 12th Amendment. And in a contingent election, they knew that we would not be voting the way we usually vote in the House, one member, one vote, but rather one state, one vote. And they knew that they controlled 27 state delegations. The Democrats controlled 22. One state, Pennsylvania, was split down the middle with 9 Democrats, 9 Republicans, and their votes would have just been nullified. I don't believe that the good at-large representative of Wyoming at the time, Liz Cheney, would have cast a vote for Donald Trump under those fraudulent circumstances. But even had she defected, they still would have had 26, and they would have been able simply to anoint Donald Trump the president. They were prepared at that point for him to storm in. Remember, he wanted to ride in on the shoulders of the mob like Mussolini, and then simply declare himself president, probably impose martial law so he could call in the National Guard that he'd been holding at bay all day long to put down the insurrectionary chaos he'd unleashed against us, and then blame the whole thing on Nancy Pelosi, which is what he proceeded to do anyway. So that was the basic plan when he was an insurrectionist. And I go back to what Lincoln said. That was an assault on the basic principle of democratic government. Where does it all leave us? Well, I would say that Section 3 of the 14th Amendment is actually a strong statement of democracy. It all leave us? Well, I would say that Section 3 of the 14th Amendment is actually a strong statement of democracy, that it is the democratic community and the democratic nation which are the important thing, not the ambitions of any one person or other. Those of us who aspire and attain to public office are nothing but the servants of the people. The moment that somebody in public office begins to think that he or she is like a king or a queen, the kind that we overthrew in the American Revolution, a lord, somebody who must be bowed down to, someone we must scrape to and defer to and curry favor with, that's the moment to eject, reject, evict, impeach, convict, scrap, and start all over again. Because the highest office in a true constitutional democracy is that of citizen. What's important is that government of the people, by the people, and for the people continue, as Lincoln put it in the Gettysburg Address. So that just deals with, I think, the big argument against use of Section 3 of the 14th Amendment, which has blown my mind, that there are people who basically want to turn off different parts of the Constitution. Like it's a dishwasher or something, you can just turn it off. You got to take the whole Constitution. It is the rule of law for all of us, and it is the operating manual for American democracy. But I promised that in these encounters I would try to be as brief as possible. You got to forgive the constitutional law professor in me. And Brian, I'm going to turn it back over to you to see if you've got some fundamental questions or ideas.
Well, I definitely have questions, and thank you for all of that. But we're going to continue in just a moment. But first, very briefly, can you tell us what we can do on our end to support you? Can you talk about Democracy Summer? And this is the basis of why we're doing this series, because we want to have some call to action here.
Well, look, we're in the fight of our lives to defend the Constitution, to defend our democracy, to defend our freedom. We need the young people of America to be engaged and mobilized, registered to vote, and participating in this election. And long ago, Brian, I turned my campaign, which spends no money on TV, radio, pollsters, consultants, none of it, I've turned it into a school, the Democracy Summer School, and it has spread first from the 8th District of Maryland to the rest of Maryland, the Mid-Atlantic, Pennsylvania, Virginia. We've spread across the country, and the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee has adopted Democracy Summer. We're hoping we'll get every one of the 50 states, as well as D.C. and the territories represented, where there will be Democracy Summer young people, high school and college kids, on the ground working in the campaigns, but also participating during the week in a series of seminars and discussions, not unlike this one, where we actually take the American Constitution, we take American history, we bring in the best historians, like Alexander Kaysar, who wrote the definitive book about the right to vote, like Tim Snyder, who everybody knows has been the great champion of the people of Ukraine and wrote on tyranny. Civil rights activist Bob Moses, who we lost a few years ago, used to kick us off in Democracy Summer. He, of course, was the motive force behind Freedom Summer. My late lamented colleague John Lewis participated. My beloved friend Benny Thompson from Mississippi, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, you name it. I mean, everybody's getting involved in Democracy Summer. And as the other party, Brian, turns itself more and more into something like a cult of personality, an authoritarian religious cult of an allegedly charismatic personality, we've got to turn ourselves into a school. And we got to do it quickly, and we need education, and we need real dialogue, and those of us in public office need to be learning from the young people because they've got thoughts and feelings and ideas and experiences we need to learn about, and we've got things to teach them. And so it's all about creating this intergenerational dialogue and then all working together as the party of democracy and freedom to move forward in the country.
And of course, I'll put a link in the post description of this video and right here on the screen. So for anybody looking to support Democracy Summer, you can go ahead and follow those links. Congressman, can you speak to the legitimacy of the threat by Republicans that if Donald Trump was ever disqualified from the ballot, that they would do the same thing to Joe Biden?
I mean, I don't discount any Republican threats of any kind at all. And of course, we know that Donald Trump's basic response to any episode of accountability in his life is, we're going to do the same to you. And so he views the rule of law in totally personal terms. Like the only reason that he's been fined hundreds of millions of dollars by New York State for deliberately committing financial fraud and repeatedly and pervasively committing financial fraud is somebody's out to get him. So he has a completely paranoid understanding of the rule of law. I mean, he steals hundreds of government documents, top secret, classified security documents. He's repeatedly told he's got to return them. There's a subpoena. He gives some of them back. He hides the rest of them, and then refuses to take responsibility for it. So I don't believe that the Supreme Court is going to make Section 3 of the 14th Amendment work. Alas, I think that the court has been so populated with right-wing Federalist Society hacks at this point, that they're not going to demonstrate fidelity to the rule of law in the text of the Constitution. If they were, you're probably right that some people would turn around and say, oh, Joe Biden engaged in insurrection or rebellion when he did some completely imaginary or fictional thing that has already been debunked more than a dozen times in the House Oversight Committee. So we could expect that, but at that point, we're just being told to give up on the rule of law, because if we try to enforce the rule of law against criminals, then they're going to turn it around and try to use it against people who abide by the law.
Can you speak on this idea that a conviction is required to disqualify anyone from the ballot under the 14th Amendment?
Well, that's not the way that it was understood after the Civil War and during Reconstruction. There wasn't even a federal insurrection statute. We just impeached Donald Trump for inciting insurrection, and that was defined in constitutional terms. It wasn't defined according to a particular statute. So if you analogize it to impeachment, it's been very clear for American history that high crimes and misdemeanors are not necessarily statutory offenses. They don't have to be. And I think it's the exact same thing here. Insurrection can be used according to its common sense understanding under the Constitution, even without regard to this or that particular statute. In any event, sometimes I hear the MAGA people saying that this is not an insurrection. Nobody has been charged or held guilty for insurrection. Look, we have hundreds of people who've been convicted of violently assaulting federal officers, destroying federal property, disrupting the peaceful transfer of power, a federal proceeding, as well as seditious conspiracy, which means conspiracy to overthrow or put down the government of the United States. So that is, in any commonsensical interpretation of the word, insurrection. Seditious conspiracy is a form of insurrection, and that's what Stuart Rhodes, the Yale Law School graduate and head of the Oath Keepers, was convicted of, seditious conspiracy, and was sentenced to, I think, 18 or 19 years in prison.
Well, given the fact that all of these underlings of Donald Trump were convicted for seditious conspiracy to that exact point, why is it that no prosecutor, in your opinion, has attempted to prosecute Donald Trump, who oversaw, who incited this whole thing in the first place?
Thinking about going solar, but not sure whether it's worth it for your home? Well,
the fact that all of these underlings of Donald Trump were convicted for seditious conspiracy to that exact point, why is it that no prosecutor, in your opinion, has attempted to prosecute Donald Trump, who oversaw, who incited this whole thing in the first place?
But I don't want to speak for the special counsel, Jack Smith. I don't know exactly what his rationale was in choosing certain offenses and not others. I'll tell you, in general, prosecutors pick the offenses where they think the evidence is overwhelming and it is easily proven beyond a reasonable doubt that a person engaged in the criminal conduct. And there, Donald Trump clearly conspired to interfere with a federal proceeding. That was the whole meaning of Stop the Steal. Go in there and blockade the possibility of the peaceful transfer of power taking place. And so they actually did that. They conspired to do that. And so, that strikes me as an easier showing than the criminal showing, beyond a reasonable doubt, that he engaged in insurrection, which isn't to say he didn't, or that case couldn't be made, but we know that Donald Trump, like all good mob bosses, is great at insulating himself from the people who actually do the dirty work, and there's always a bit of a buffer there. I mean, here there was less, because of the speech he made, where he came right out and said, you got to go and fight, and you got to fight like hell, and if you don't, we're not going to have a country anymore. And when fraud is involved, all the rules are off, or a different set of rules applies. And so there was a lot of language which demonstrated he was inciting an insurrection, and I think that that's perfectly clear even without trying to get all of the evidence that he's been trying to hide from people.
Criminal conviction aside, there are a number of judges who did find, as a matter of fact, that Trump engaged in insurrection. There was Judge Carter in California, Judge Wallace in Colorado. There was the Colorado Supreme Court. Do you believe that that's enough of a predicate unto itself for Section 3 of the 14th Amendment to kick in?
Well, look, the Supreme Court is going to give us some kind of interpretation of Section 3 of the 14th Amendment. It might be the most minimal interpretation, which is basically that the courts don't have anything to do with it unless and until Congress acts to define insurrection, or Congress acts to set up a process by which people are deemed to be insurrectionists. I believe that Donald Trump, for all practical purposes, has already been defined as an insurrectionist who engaged in insurrection by the House and by the Senate in impeaching him for incitement to insurrection and for voting 57 to 43 to find that he'd engaged in insurrection. So that gives us whatever factual predicate is necessary to corroborate what the Colorado Supreme Court did by engaging in a far more searching and thorough fact-finding process, simply because they had a lot more time, and they also had the benefit of the work of the January 6th Select Committee, which I was proud to serve on under Chairman Thompson and Liz Cheney, who was the vice chair of the committee.
Now, if Section 3 of the 14th Amendment didn't apply to Donald Trump, what would somebody have to do for it to actually apply to them?
Well, what was amazing to me about the oral argument, Brian, was how much everybody was basically taking it for granted that he was an insurrectionist. So much of the discussion was based on the idea, well, let's assume that he really was. And the argument was far more about whether it was all right for a particular state to act to exclude him from the primary ballot when these Republican voters came in to say he was excluded because he was an insurrectionist, and then for the Colorado Supreme Court to uphold that, and then for the U.S. Supreme Court to issue an interpretation that would apply to the country. That struck me as a very logical thing that Colorado was asking for. They were saying, we have interpreted the federal Constitution as we must because it is supreme under the Supremacy Clause of the Constitution. The U.S. Constitution is supreme over federal law, over state constitutions and state law all the way down. And so we all have to interpret the U.S. Constitution. And so when Justice Kagan said, well, does that mean that one state could make a decision that would affect the rest of the country in a presidential election? Of course it means that. That's built into the Electoral College system. Most states, for example, have restored the voting rights of people who are former prisoners. They've said if you've done good time, you get out of prison, you have every other right restored to you, you can vote too. But there's 6 or 7 states which still say, no, you can't vote if you're a former prisoner. You're just disenfranchised for life unless the governor pardons you. Well, that dramatically affects what's going to happen in the election in that state, and that's going to affect the outcome in the election. But in any event, although that's how electoral federalism works, and I was really surprised by that question, what the Secretary of State and the Supreme Court of Colorado and the Attorney General were saying is, now we want the U.S. Supreme Court to exercise its authority under Marbury versus Madison to say what the law is, to look at the entire factual record that's been assembled in painstaking detail by the Colorado courts, and then to determine whether or not Donald Trump was an insurrectionist who engaged in insurrection, and whether he should be barred from the ballot or not.
I want to draw everybody's attention back to something that you said just earlier about the qualifications for being on the ballot. I know we kind of breeze over this idea of whether or not this will be enforced, but Section 3 of the 14th Amendment is essentially one of 4 disqualifying factors for a president in the entire Constitution. You spoke about 35 years old, natural-born citizen, already served 2 terms, and didn't engage in or give aid or comfort to those who've engaged in insurrection. You can literally be a murderer in prison and still not face any prohibitions from running for the presidency of the United States. So can you speak to the significance of this clause, given how few disqualifying factors there actually are in the Constitution?
Just stocked up on a ton of Paleo Valley beef sticks.
Can you speak to the significance of this clause, given how few disqualifying factors there actually are in the Constitution?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great point. When the radical Republicans brought the 14th Amendment forward in 1868, they were really trying to create a revolution in American political society, which had been so based on white supremacy and slavery before the Civil War took place. And so, the 13th Amendment had abolished slavery, and the 14th Amendment proclaimed equal protection and due process against the state governments. Section 2 of the 14th Amendment was an effort to actually punish states if they continued to disenfranchise the African American male population. And then Section 3 of the 14th Amendment started off as a very broad principle. The strong radical Republicans, I think including Thaddeus Stevens of Pennsylvania, they wanted to say anybody who engages in insurrection or rebellion, anyone, whether or not they'd served in public office before or not, shall never be allowed to vote again or hold public office. So you can see how broad that was. They wanted to disenfranchise everybody who'd participated in the secession or in any future insurrection. And when it got over to the Senate, they said that's far too broad. We need a narrower principle here. And so they said it should not apply to everybody who participates in insurrection, but only those people who are most culpable. And by that we mean the people who actually were sworn to support and defend the Constitution against all comers, against all enemies, foreign and domestic, and yet broke that promise and engaged in insurrection. And even in the case of those people, we're not going to disenfranchise them. People like Robert E. Lee or Jefferson Davis or Donald Trump, they can still vote, which is the main attribute of citizenship. They can still participate and they can vote, but they can't be trusted with public office before because they've proven themselves to be disloyal and untrustworthy. So it's actually a very narrow principle that's embodied in the Constitution, and the question is whether our judiciary will do its job in enunciating what the law says and what it means.
Now, let's finish off with this, and I do want to give you a moment after you answer this question if you want to have any last words to folks watching right now. But if today was the last day of the semester and you were still teaching constitutional law, which obviously we're trying to resurrect right here, what would you tell your students with regard to the idea of barring insurrectionists who are former federal office holders from the ballot, given the moment we're in right now?
The great Tom Paine, who my son Tommy was named after, said at the time of the revolution, the times have found us. The times have found us. And I think the times have found us again, because democracy is under siege all over the world. And freedom is under siege all over the world. And they go together, of course. It's no accident that during the same time period that we get the January 6th insurrectionary violence and attempted coup against the election and the Constitution, we also get the Dobbs decision overturning a half century of jurisprudence maintaining women's rights of control over their own bodies and their own futures. The attack on democracy almost always doubles as an attack on freedom. In fact, Lincoln had a beautiful image when he was asked about, well, what's the relationship between constitutional democracy and the freedom that's set forth in the Declaration? And he said, well, constitutional democracy is like the beautiful silver frame upon which rests the golden apple of freedom, by which I take him to mean that democracy is necessary for freedom. The autocrats of the world in Moscow, like Vladimir Putin, or the kleptocrats of the world in Mar-a-Lago, like Donald Trump, or the theocrats of the world, like in Saudi Arabia or Iran, are never going to protect your freedom. Our only hope for freedom is in a democratic society, a constitutional democracy with the rule of law. That's where we have the hope of maintaining our freedom and our liberty. But note that it's only necessary, it's not sufficient. I mean, we had the 14th Amendment, And then in 1896, in Plessy versus Ferguson, the Supreme Court retreated to the baseline of white supremacy and said, well, Jim Crow apartheid is perfectly consistent with equal protection because equal protection must be read through the prism of the customs and traditions and usages of the people. And racial apartheid, segregation, Jim Crow were all seen as part of the customs and traditions of the states. Of course, the real role of revolutionary constitutional principles is to destabilize customs and traditions and usages that violate people's freedoms. So, all of which is to say, this is a moment when constitutional patriots can be standing up and must be standing up for democracy and freedom in our country. But I don't want to overly idolize it. As I was saying at the beginning, the Constitution is a living document, not in the sense that the words live. The words, of course, don't live, or they only live through the actions of people. But the Constitution can change by virtue of constitutional amendment. And what we do to change the federal laws and change state laws and change state constitutions and ultimately change the U.S. Constitution itself. It lives through us, and it's an unfolding project. It's always unfinished business, the Constitution of the United States. So even as we defend the Electoral College, for example, in the counting of Electoral College votes on January 6th against Donald Trump and those who would mobilize violence and trickery to try to overthrow a lawfully elected president like Joe Biden, also, we must be talking about doing the obvious thing. It's 2024. It's time for us to be electing the president the way we elect governors and representatives and senators and mayors and everybody else. Whoever gets the most votes wins. You know, we should be having a popular election for president, which is why I've been a big champion of the National Popular Vote campaign and the movement for national popular vote. So we both have to defend the existing edifice of democracy against criminal violence and coups, but we also have to keep democracy moving. Tocqueville said in Democracy in America that he observed that democracy and voting rights are either shrinking and shriveling away, or they're growing and they're expanding. And I think that's right. And I think we've got to get back on the growth track. So now is a time, I think, for people to find their inner constitutional patriot and to be fighting for greater democracy and freedom in the country.
Well, that was perfectly put. Before we end this, I want to give the floor to you again, Congressman, to let the viewers know what they can expect in upcoming episodes of this series.
Well, next time we're going to look at this right-wing fallacy about presidential immunity. Donald Trump has now stated it in the most sweeping and categorical form. He says that as commander-in-chief, the president has the power to do whatever he wants and absolute immunity from any legal consequences for criminal actions, unless he were first impeached by the House and then convicted by the Senate, something which has, of course, never happened all the way in American history. So we're going to look at this claim of absolute presidential immunity.
And obviously, you know, all of this, whether we're talking about disqualification or presidential immunity, is very much in the news right now. So hopefully what the congressman just laid out will inform your thoughts about the moment that we're in right now, and more importantly, help debunk some of the disinformation that we're contending with from the right as they continue to exploit the Constitution for their own partisan benefit. Of course, to support this series, as I mentioned before, I again ask for one thing. Please check the post description of this video for ways to support Democracy Summer. And of course, leave us your comments, your thoughts. What did you think about this video? If you have questions for myself or the congressman, definitely leave them in the comment section below. And if you enjoyed this video, as the congressman mentioned, we've got an amazing episode coming up next time as we explore this question that is just as relevant as the one we just spoke about. So to see more, please make sure to subscribe. I'm Brian Tyler Cohen.
I'm Jamie Raskin.
And this is Class with Jamie Raskin.